This is our planet, beautiful planet from the Russian, from a Russian satellite as it looks today, but it hasn't always looked like that. There were, during the last ice age, the last ice age reached its maximum about 21,000 years ago, and it was mostly gone by 10,000 years ago. And at the peak of the ice age, the last glacial maximum, you had ice caps that were actually 2 miles deep, sitting on top of North America and on top of Northern Europe, and creating a very different world from the world in which we live today in lots of ways. But one of those ways just concerns the outlines of the continents. This is how they look today. This is how they looked during the Ice Age. There was no Red Sea, for example. There was no Arabian Gulf. Southeast Asia was a gigantic continent, not a series of islands and peninsulas, called Sunda. The geologists call it Sundaland, which extended far off into the Pacific. Papua New Guinea was joined to Australia. Everywhere, coastlines were greatly expanded. And actually, what happened with the meltdown of the Ice Age is that 10 million square miles of land, which is roughly the size of Europe and China added together, was submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last Ice Age. How can we possibly get to grips with our past if we don't take account of the fact that we've lost 10 million square miles of the record? And why is the main resources of marine archaeology devoted on looking for shipwrecks, you know, when we really should be exploring the lost lands at the end of the last Ice Age? Famous Piri-Reis map, famous because of the argument that it shows Antarctica. Okay, Piri-Reis map, relevant to our trip. It was found in the Topkapi Palace. It was drawn by Admiral Piri-Reis, who wrote a big book of navigation, the Bahariya. And he tells us in his own handwriting, this is only a fragment of a world map that he created. The rest of the map has been lost. He tells us in his own handwriting on the map that the Piri-Reis map, his map, was based on more than 100 older source maps. And he tells us that those source maps were in such a fragile, disintegrating state that he decided to preserve the information on them by creating a copy, a new map, which was a composite derived from 100 older source maps. And we see, amongst other things, the west coast of Africa here, the east coast of South America, and down here we'll come to the issue of Antarctica. But I'd just like to draw attention to this thing here, which is this island off the coast of North America, which does not exist today, but which is in the place of the Grand Bahama Banks. And the Grand Bahama Banks were a large exposed landmass at the end of the last Ice Age. And it's really interesting that running up the middle of this island is a row of megaliths placed in a line, exactly like the controversial Bimini Road, which lies underwater on the Grand Bahama Banks. In preserving the information on those older source maps, Piri-Reis seems to have preserved a time when the Bimini Road was above water on an island. That is really, really fascinating if you stop to think about it. The other issue is Antarctica. It's been a subject of great controversy for decades, but it does seem to show a greatly extended South American coastline butting into an enlarged Antarctica as it looked during the last Ice Age. Now here's Antarctica as it looks today, and here is Antarctica as it looked on honest maps of the early 1800s. When I say honest maps, I mean maps based on the navigational knowledge of that time. This Russian map from the early 1800s shows nothing where Antarctica is. And that's honest because in 1800 we hadn't discovered Antarctica. It was discovered in 1818. So when you draw a map in 1800, how can you show Antarctica? The anomaly is that Antarctica appears on many maps from earlier periods, from the 1500s, 1600s, maps like the Piri-Reis map that were based on older source maps now lost, like the Orontius Phineas map, which shows a greatly enlarged Antarctica in exactly the right place. Or several of the Mercator maps, which again show us Antarctica in the right place. Well, the scholars don't like this either, and they say, look, you know, those map makers, they just wanted to balance the world. They felt that there should be something heavy at the bottom that would balance it, so they put an imaginary Antarctica there, and by chance it just happens to look really like Antarctica as it looked during the last Ice Age. This Ptolemaic map is interesting for a tiny detail, and that is the island of High Brazil, depicted off the coast of Ireland. You couldn't find High Brazil in 1513 because it wasn't there, and a ship was an inappropriate vehicle to find it in. What you would have needed was a time machine. If you went back between 12 and 13,000 years ago, you would have found an island in exactly the right place, of exactly the right size, exactly where this map says it is. Again, a suggestion that maps based on older source maps incorporate knowledge of the world that is anachronistic, that should not be there according to the prevailing model of history. It looks like somebody was mapping the world very accurately during the last ice age. How do we explain that? This map, the Waldseebuller map, shows a greatly extended Southeast Asia, much more, I would say, like the Southeast Asia of the Ice Age than like the Southeast Asia of 1507. And while we're on the subject of Southeast Asia, let us go and visit the island of Java, where something very interesting has recently rocked the world of archaeology. And that something very interesting is Gunung Padang in West Java. The site has been known for a long time. It's been known actually since about 1914, and it has been attributed to the period between, it's old, they accepted it was old, they attributed it to the period between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, which does not disturb the mainstream model of history. That is the period when people are allowed to have built megaliths. Until along comes Danny Hillman, the senior geologist at Indonesia's Geotechnology Center, who has been conducting an extensive survey of Gunung Padang for the last 5 years. And he has now published, and he says that on his evidence, he's sorry that he's upsetting a lot of people with this, but Gunung Padang is definitely older than 9,000 years, and it could be up to 20,000 years old. It's another Göbekli Tepe, if you like. It is a piece of hard evidence that is rewriting history. He says it's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. And this is views of Gunung Padang, and Santa and I will be going there in May when we're making an extensive trip to Indonesia and also to Australia. It's built out of basalt, which forms these hexagonal patterns. And bearing in mind that architectural style, it's interesting to hop over here to Ponape, which also happens to be on the precessional grid, which lies 54 degrees of longitude east of Angkor. Remember, 54 is half of 108, 108 is 72 plus 36. And on Ponape, we find hills rather like Gunung Padang, and which turns out to be an artificial hill. And we find megalithic architecture based on hexagonal basalt, same construction material. And this is Nan Duwas, which is the most prominent structure of Nan Madol. And again, you can see the similarities with Gunung Padang in the construction. And it's making me wonder about the whole dating sequence at Nan Madol, especially when we remember that Nan Madol stands on the edge of the sea, a sea that was once much lower. Sea level rose actually by 400 feet at the end of the last ice age. And if you go down here, if you go diving, you find that the ruins continue underwater, and they continue down and down and down. And as you get deeper, you find huge pillars rising up out of the seabed. This is a very spooky place to dive, I have to say. The visibility is poor. The local legend is that there's an underwater city there, which is guarded by 2 gigantic sharks. And when you're in that murk, your mind can't help playing on the prospect of gigantic sharks. They just come along and swallow you up. Again, more of these pillars and columns that are found underwater, some of them fallen. Very interested in this one in particular, because of its similarity to these fallen pillars, which are found on the island of Tinian, not so far away, which happened to be the island that America launched the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki from. I think we're looking at something very similar here, and it again raises questions over the age of the Tinian megaliths. And let's just pop into Japan briefly. Here is Japan today. Here is Japan as it looked 12,400 years ago, 10,400 BC, give or take a few hundred years. Hokkaido is a separate island, but Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu are all joined into one landmass. And that landmass has a deep inlet here and here. Interestingly, an ancient map from 1424 that shows Japan, where it's called Satanase, the Pisagano chart, shows it with these two inlets in exactly the right places, and shows it as one landmass. In other words, this map of Japan, made in 1424 from an earlier source map, actually shows Japan as it looked 12,400 years ago. How do we explain that? Well, we go diving in Japan. And Santa and I put in hundreds and hundreds of dives around Japan, 200 of them are off the island of Yonaguni, which mainstream archaeology insists is entirely natural phenomenon. Strange natural phenomena, but natural nonetheless. Like these two megaliths, for example. Well, these two megaliths, they fell into place there from a cliff overhead. And luckily they didn't break when they fell from the cliff. They perfectly slotted into that gap, and that's the explanation for them. The fact that the cliff is actually 500 feet back from the place where these megaliths are found does not deter that explanation at all. But that is the official explanation. There are the two megaliths side by side, and here's this huge outcrop of definitely natural rock, I don't dispute that. But let's swim around here now, going east, and let's see what we find. And what we find are the famous terraces of Yonaguni, and with these beautifully cut stairs and steps in them on a very large scale. I'm not sure what Yonaguni was, but I am sure it's man-made, and I believe, having put in 200 plus dives there, that I can say so with some authority. There are many visiting firemen who've gone into Yonaguni, many of whom don't really even know how to dive, who've been taken down fighting for their lives by Japanese divers who've showed them a few minutes of the site, who've left and said it's completely natural. But if you really work the site, and you work it over a period of 4 or 5 years as we did, and you repeatedly dive on it, and you study all its details and aspects, then you begin to be absolutely persuaded that this is a man-made site. There's just too much going on there to allow for it to be entirely the work of nature. If it was the work of nature, the argument goes that there are soft and hard layers of rock here, and that the sea beating against this cliff face, as it was, as the sea level rose, selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place. It's not as an absurd an idea as it sounds. This is sedimentary rock. But then my question is, where is the debris that the sea swept away? And where I want to see the debris is at the bottom of this drop-off here. There's the steps. I want to see the debris down here. But I don't see the debris down there. What I see is a clear pathway with all the debris nicely cleared to one side, which I would say is a sure handiwork of man, not of nature, particularly since there's a gutter along this side of the path. And let's go to the face now, the gigantic face that's underwater at Yonaguni. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. Again, the mainstream says, oh, you just recognize faces everywhere, you know, it can't be a face, it's just a natural thing. It can't be a face at all. I'm in there for scale. It's huge. There are pupils in the eyes. Interestingly, if it's natural, interesting how nature chose to separate the head off from the bedrock behind it in that way. And interesting how there's a headdress. Just the remnants of a headdress here that you can see, I think, quite clearly there. And as we pull back away from it, we find that it's situated in a context. This large flat area in front of it, and again, gutters, 2 gutters down the side of this pathway here. I'm absolutely certain that this is a man-made structure, and I'm certain this is as well. This is, to me, this is the one that they can never refute, and nobody has refuted it. And this is the Kerama Stone Circle, some hundreds of miles north of Yonaguni, off the island of Okinawa. of a group of islands called the Keramas, about 40 miles west of Okinawa, of the Okinawan capital Naha. And there we find small river stones cemented to the seabed, and we find this gigantic stone circle which is not built, it is cut out of the bedrock. Cut out of the bedrock the way the Sphinx is cut out of the bedrock. And you can see again the scale here of this thing, the central upright, the surrounding megaliths. And let's just get in a bit closer and take a look at it. The surrounding megaliths make a kind of spiral around the central upright. And you know, I'm impressed by the way the outer curve of the central upright is matched by the inner curve of the outer uprights here. I see no way that nature could have made this. I think it's absolutely convincing. It's 110 feet underwater. It's been underwater for more than 12,000 years. It therefore doesn't fit in to the conventional view of history. We will pop over now to Easter Island. Easter Island is the exception that proves the rule, because Easter Island today is not quite on the grid. It's about 60 or 70 miles off the grid, about a degree of longitude off the grid. What's interesting is that during the last glacial maximum, Easter Island was much bigger than it is today. And Schock again was making this point in his in the talk that we heard on the bus. That Easter Island was a much larger place, and that the largest of the archipelago that was Easter Island was precisely on the precessional grid. And this begins to raise the question, which I thought Schock did very well in the talk we were listening to tonight, of the age of the Easter Island monuments, which has traditionally been given very young, 700 to 1,000 years old, really. They're supposed to be these famous moai and the ahu on which they stand. But if we go around behind this moai, we can see that the ahu is a rather poorly made ahu, and that constructed into it indeed is an ancient Easter Island head. And this is the key piece of new evidence that Schock has brought forward, which concerns the issue of the age of these structures in the Ranararaku crater. Because, as he pointed out, these heads go far beneath the ground, and they have been covered not by some sort of landslide, not by some sort of tidal wave debris, but by sedimentation, by not 700 or 800 years of sedimentation, but by thousands of years of sedimentation. And Thor Heyerdahl showed us how deep these structures go. And Schock's view is that we may be looking at 10,000 plus years of sedimentation, 10 to 12,000 years of sedimentation, covering the gigantic buried figures of Easter Island. And anybody who's been to Göbekli Tepe and to Easter Island cannot fail to note the similar aspects of the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe and the megaliths of Easter Island, particularly the hands on this figure, which cross above its waist, just as the hands on the Easter Island figure do. Rather extended figures, that crooked elbow and the hands joining at the waist above a sort of belt. Very, very similar. And again, we find that similarity. You'll see this in the museum at Urfa in this figure, which is roughly of the same age as Göbekli Tepe, and which was found in Sanliurfa. And again, the hands joining at the waist like that. Again, I'm covering material that Schock covered in his talk that was played on the bus, but it was Thor Heyerdahl who first drew attention to the astonishing similarity between this ahu in Easter Island with its huge and perfectly constructed megaliths in jigsaw puzzle patterns and the megaliths of Sacsayhuaman in Peru. That it seems to be the same style of architecture. And I'm actually not sure whether it's, Schock was saying maybe it was Easter Island influencing Peru, maybe it was Peru influencing Easter Island, which was Heyerdahl's idea, or maybe it's a remote common source influencing both of them. It could be, but there's definitely something in common with these patterns. And there is no historical source that tells us the Incas built these walls. The Incas, I believe, found these walls. The only document we have which speaks of the Incas trying to move a stone on this scale, describes them as miserably failing, and 3,000 of them being killed in the attempt to draw it towards Sacsayhuaman. We don't have any account that tells of them successfully moving stones on this scale. And a group of local researchers, Jesus Gamarra and his deceased father before him, are making a strong case that the rock-cut features of Sacsayhuaman and the Andes in general date from a much earlier period, and that the megalithic walls from a period slightly after that, and the Inca stuff is relatively poor and recent. There are vitrified stone and precision cut channels at Kenco in the Andes. You have this amazing site of Ollantaytambo, and interestingly, on the walls, the megalithic walls of Ollantaytambo, are carved step pyramids. And if we pop over to Tiwanaku in Bolivia, not so far away, we find a step pyramid, very ruined, the Acapana pyramid in Tiwanaku, and here the structure called the Calasasilla. And again, I made the case in Fingerprints of the Gods that Tiwanaku may be much, much older than the 1500 or 1000 BC that it is attributed to, and part of that again is astronomy. It's too detailed to go into at this time of night, to do with changing position of sunrise on the summer solstice, but puts it at about 10,000 BC, the gateway of the sun being involved in that alignment. On the reverse of the gateway of the sun, annoyingly for Egyptologists, we have a mammoth. Not Egyptologists, I mean, you know, archaeologists in general. See, the problem is that mammoths went extinct in South America more than 12,000 years ago. So to have those two big ears, the two eyes, and the two tusks of a mammoth on the gateway of the sun suggests that the gateway of the sun might be 12,000 plus years old. They say it's birds, actually. They say it's two birds. I don't see birds there somehow, but that's what it's. But these are birds, but I don't see this as birds. Interestingly, there's H-shaped blocks at Tiwanaku, and they remind me of the H-shaped motifs that we find at Göbekli Tepe as well. Let's hop over to, let's just take a look at these monoliths at Tiwanaku, which again have got their hands crossed in rather the Göbekli Tepe way. No, I don't think they're holding alien ray guns. What I think they're holding are snuff trays, actually. And this has been argued by ethnobotanist Manuel Torres, that these are snuff trays and other paraphernalia for the consumption of DMT. The powdered seeds of Anadenanthera colubrina and Anadenanthera peregrina, and that they do resemble snuff trays still found in the Amazon today. Interestingly, Francisco de Orellana made a long and unexpected trip down the Amazon in the 1540s. He actually thought he was going off on a half-day hunting expedition, but the Amazon carried him all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And on the way, he observed many large and sophisticated cities along the banks of the Amazon, which he reported in his adventure. And he spoke about the tribes and their skill and what he saw, highly civilized peoples in the Amazon. Later on, it was considered to have made all this up, because of course the Amazon is pristine jungle. The idea that there could be human civilizations in the Amazon completely absurd in terms of mainstream archaeology, and obviously Orellana was just making it up to glorify himself. Well, so it was believed until the relatively recent and horrendous and devastatingly sad clearances of the Amazon, which have revealed the remains of gigantic cities in the Amazon. And those cities were depopulated soon after Orellana's time. And they were depopulated by smallpox, which the Spanish introduced to the Americas. And which, by the way, the smallpox was deliberately introduced in Tenochtitlan by Cortez. By the time Pizarro got to Peru, smallpox had already reached Peru. It had traveled faster than the Spanish could. And it devastated the populations of the lost garden cities of the Andes and of the Amazon. And it's now clear that the Amazon is a human-engineered zone, that people have been working the Amazon for thousands and thousands of years, and that it is not pristine rainforest. It is a habitat that has been effectively created by human beings, and one of the most interesting aspects of that habitat is terra preta, the black soil of the Amazon, which is an amazing, miraculous, self-replicating soil filled with bacteria, constantly replenishes its own fertility. The scientific studies show that it goes back, somebody created this soil, it's a man-made product, at least 11,000 years ago. So is the Amazon like a desert, like the sea, like the ocean? Is it covering many secrets of the past underneath that jungle? And that's what the clearances are showing. Huge earthworks are emerging from the Amazon as it is being sadly cleared for cattle ranches. And even megalithic circles are being found in the Amazon. I think there's a whole lost civilization story to tell in the Amazon, and I intend to do so in my forthcoming book. I've already spoken about the remarkable feat of ethnopharmacology that's involved in the ayahuasca brew, selecting these two plants out of 150,000 different species of plants and trees to produce the psychoactive ayahuasca brew. That is a work of science. We are looking at an incredible scientific achievement that is vastly ancient in the Amazon. Trial and error would be most difficult. I've spoken of acacia nilotica, dimethyltryptamine, and the whole story of alchemt and chemistry and alchemy that we get from ancient Egypt. And I think we need to reconsider scenes like this from ancient Egypt, particularly since these stars are connected to the initiate through the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is the place that our endogenous DMT is produced. So I'm going very near the end of the talk now, you'll be relieved to hear. And I want to go back to this whole issue of the sky and the ground, and that an enormous effort seems to have been made to draw our attention to the period between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. Are we being told that something of great significance for the world happened in this period? Something perhaps that led to the destruction of a great global civilization, something on a scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic astro-architectural projects around the globe by the survivors of that civilization, I would suggest. Something to mark and commemorate it. Well, this is where I want to talk about comets, and everybody remembers Shoemaker-Levy 9 in 1994, that freight train of a comet that fragmented, that was torn apart by the gravity of Jupiter, and that smashed into Jupiter with dramatic and horrific effects. Let me tell you that if Shoemaker-Levy 9 had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. Our planet actually would be sterile. There would be nothing left of us. And this is the moment to say a deep and profound thank you to Jupiter. Thank you, Jupiter. Because Jupiter is the giant guardian of the Earth. Jupiter, circling in the outer solar system with its huge gravity, just sucks in the majority of comets that would long ago have extinguished life on Earth, were it not for the presence of Jupiter. And Jupiter is big enough to take it, whereas the Earth is not. But occasionally comets get through. And it's been clear since 2007 that there is a smoking gun. You see, when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods and published it in 1995, I focused on the period between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, but I could not put my finger on exactly the smoking gun. I was talking about various theories to do with the end of the last ice age, including Earth crust displacement, and it was obvious to me that something cataclysmic had happened at that time, but it wasn't clear what. What's happened since, and this is one of the other main reasons why I'm writing a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, is the growing evidence that our planet was hit by a gigantic fragmenting comet 12,900 years ago. There's been a lot of argument about this. The argument has gone back and forward. A lot of academics have objected to the comet, but the new research that keeps coming out is absolutely convincing, and there's really no doubt anymore that a comet did hit the Earth roughly 12,900 years ago, and that it was responsible for what is called the Younger Dryas. Geologists have been aware of the Younger Dryas for a very long time, but roughly from 12,900 years ago down to about 11,800 or 11,700 years ago, we had, just as the Earth was coming out of the last ice age, we had a sudden deep freeze, an unexpected, anomalous, massive deep freeze of the Earth's climate, which was responsible for the extinction of huge numbers of animal species at that time. And it's called the Younger Dryas, but what caused the Younger Dryas has not been clear until we have the comet evidence. And what the comet evidence tells us is that the comet was responsible, that it sent up a huge cloud of dust into the upper atmosphere, that the dust reflected back the sun's rays, that the Earth froze rapidly for about 1,000 years, and it was a horrendous time to live on Earth. And I believe that it wasn't only hunter-gatherers and large animal species that became extinct at that time, I think that's when we lost a whole civilization. Of course, the mainstream view wants it just to be hunter-gatherers that were wiped out, but I think we need to be reconsidering all of that evidence now. This is now very much entering the mainstream, and I think that we cannot consider any questions of the origins of human civilization without taking this comet impact into account. Getting very close to the end now, we'll hop over to the Temple of Horus at Edfu, which is rather like those maps. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is a recent place, it's Ptolemaic, but it contains on its walls the complete text of a much earlier document. And this document is called the Edfu Building Texts. And what they say is that that document, which was inscribed on animal skins, was so fragile that they decided to preserve it and copy it onto the walls of a lasting memorial, which is the Temple of Edfu. And here are the Edfu building texts, which speak of the homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great flood. By the way, that comet, very large fragments of it, hit the North American ice cap. That's why there aren't many impact craters, because they hit 2-mile deep ice. They flashed that deep ice into a tremendous heat. There was a huge flood released from the ice cap at that time. And just gigantic global cataclysm took place. And they tell how the primeval ones, the gods, I read, the survivors of a lost civilization, came to Egypt and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land, which would form the place of all future temples and pyramids in Egypt. In Tiwanaku, we have those gods too. They're called the Viracochas. They're heavily bearded and mustachioed. They were said to have white skin. They don't fit the pattern of ancient American Indians at all. And we have the same story in Mexico, where those gods are associated with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, also white-skinned and bearded, who came in a time of darkness to bring civilization to a devastated land, and who, we are told, was eventually driven out from that land, promising that he would one day return. It was that promise that Cortez was later able to take advantage of, promising that he was one day return. Interestingly, when he was driven out of the land, he is said to have left Mexico on a raft of serpents. Very curious idea. He sailed away on a raft of serpents woven together. I can't help note that at Göbekli Tepe we have a raft of serpents. They call it a net of serpents. There are their heads, and there are their bodies, all internested. They call it a net of serpents. That's what Klaus Schmidt calls it, but I can't help thinking raft of serpents, story of Quetzalcoatl. Many of these bearded figures are found throughout Mexico, and in the oldest archaeological layers, and I think they may be much older than those layers themselves. Even the figures on Easter Island, when you look at those huge chins, turns out they're bearded figures too. And this brings me finally to another bunch of bearded figures who weirdly are carrying man bags. See their cute little man bags there? And why is he wearing a fish on his head? You know, I mean, why is he wearing a fish on his head? He's called a fish-garbed figure. He is from Babylon, and he is associated with a supposedly mythical creature called Oannes, who emerged from the waters of the ocean after the Great Flood, bringing civilization to a devastated mankind. He was a restorer of civilization, a civilizing hero. He wears the head of the fish because he was able to survive the flood like a fish. In fact, he's described as a hybrid between a fish and a man. But I'm interested in these man bags that he's carrying, because we find the same man bag in the hands of the figure from La Venta, out there in Mexico, the feathered serpent and the same man bag. Now that's a very odd thing. It could be a coincidence, of course, but it's odd. And I'm beginning to wonder, are we looking at the symbolism of some kind of cult of survivors who spread around the world, and that this bag, I don't know, maybe it contained their stash of DMT, I'm not sure. This bag, you know, is their symbol. And archaeologists say that these are supposed to be tombs, but they look a lot like man bags to me at Göbekli Tepe. So, getting closer, I promise, to the end Osiris, another bearded figure. There's a resonance, 72 conspirators. There's a resonance between the sky of 10,500 BC and the sky of today. Then Orion was at its lowest point, Draco was at its highest point, Leo was rising in the east, Aquarius was setting in the west. Today it's the opposite, Orion's at its highest point, Draco's at its lowest point, Aquarius is rising in the east, Leo is setting in the west. Halfway around the precessional cycle, half of 25,920 years. It's interesting that the refined estimates put the comet impact at 12,890 years ago, because just roughly then we find ourselves half a precessional cycle away from the closing of the Mayan calendar. Suppose, I'm asking, I'm not saying that the end of the world is nigh, but I'm suggesting that there may still be some fragments of that comet in orbit, that it may have been a long period comet. Very likely it was. What goes around comes around, and long period comets can have orbits of 12,000 plus years. And it's just possible that other fragments of the comet that hit the Earth 12,980 years ago are still in orbit and may be coming back. Remembering Shoemaker-Levy 9 again, it's interesting that the brightest object in the sky in 21 December 2013, just 1 year out, which is not bad calculation when we bear in mind the Mayan calendar, is going to be a comet. It's comet Ison. It's going to be brighter than the full moon. Good news is it's not going to hit us. It's going to miss, but we should keep an alert eye to the sky. Comets only become visible when they outgas. Outgassing is caused by proximity to the sun. They're often covered in a thick, tarry substance, and they can be completely dark to telescopes until they start outgassing. I think that the sense of a warning in the Mayan calendar cannot be completely ignored. There is a growing awareness and recognition that our planet is a sacred realm. And one thing's for sure is that the Mayan calendar in its last cycle measured a period of 5,126 years, which is the period from 3,114 BC to 2012 AD. And that, interestingly, is the period of the great cities. That's the historical period of urban life, of the big states, of the big centralized hierarchical religions, of the great corporations. That is the period that is coming to an end now. I think we all know it's broken. I think we all know a new model needs to be put in place. And the great thing about being human is we do have the power of choice, and we can make a better world if we want to, remembering the lessons of the past with reverence and with respect. So, thank you.